All right. With all that said, let's go ahead and transition here to our best picture movie series. So we are winding down here, talking about the 1960s. Again, to reiterate, in case you have joined us partially through or halfway through this series, we are doing this a decade at a time, 10
Yeah.
weeks, going through the 1960s. In this case, we did the 1940s last year. So if you missed any of our conversations on the winners of the 1940s, you can go and check those out in the In Session Film archives at insessionfilm.com. And we are now rounding out the 60s here with Midnight Cowboy. This is a film that both Brendan and I have seen before. I believe you noted that you have
Yeah.
seen this film.
Yep. Yep. This was
I
maybe
have
the
as well.
third. I think for the purposes of this review, this may have been the third time I've seen it.
Yeah, second or third time for me for sure.
Yeah.
I can't really recall, but I have seen the film before. Definitely have seen the film before.
Mm-hmm.
And there's certainly plenty to talk about given the context of this series. And I am excited to dive into that.
All I'll say is this, we're ending the 1960s Best Picture winning series here with this movie, which means we will eventually move to a new decade at some point. I feel like given this transitional point in Hollywood, we have no choice but to go to the 70s next. I feel like we might have
to.
Yeah.
We might have to. Yeah. Yeah. Midnight Cowboy. This is a film that won 3 Oscars. It won for picture, obviously, director, and also screenplay.
Mm-hmm.
As it stands, it is the only X-rated film or equivalent of the current NC-17 to win Best Picture. I don't think that will, but who knows? We're in a new era in 2025, so
I mean, the criteria has changed. The criteria has changed as far as how the MPAA defines ratings now, because just like it's just shifted so much. I mean, look at the movie that just won Best Picture. There's a gratuitous nature to Anora, right?
Yeah.
Imagine a movie like that back in 1969. That would absolutely be an X-rated
honestly,
movie.
Now that you say that, in terms of its explicit content, Anora is more explicit than Midnight Cowboy.
It kind of is. It kind of is. And I mean, I don't mean to get ahead of myself, but I bring up a movie like Anora for a very specific reason, because I don't know if Sean Baker has ever cited Midnight Cowboy as one of his favorite movies, but I can kind of see a lot of his, I can see a lot of him in this one.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of Sean Baker in Midnight Cowboy.
Yeah.
Whether consciously or subconsciously, he was influenced by that film. There's no doubt
I think so. I think so.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Are you ready to get into this? Is there any other context that you feel like you need to kind of get off your chest before we go here?
I'll just simply say, and this will certainly play into our thoughts on the movie, just given the influence that it had, whether it be consciously or even subconsciously, as you talked about. I rewatched this movie with my wife in the room, and full disclosure, she was only passively with the movie. It's just not quite her type of movie.
Yeah.
But there are a few moments here that she very, very instinctually recognized. One of them being Dustin Hoffman's Ratso slamming on a car, crossing the street, going, "I'm walking here. I'm walking here."
One of the most iconic lines in all of cinema.
It is. It is. But she made a great point, and I have to give her credit for this. How this movie may have spearheaded every New York stereotype going forward. It just goes to show how influential that it was. So I wanted to make that known, just given the influence of this movie and how it might play into our overall thoughts on it.
Every single American at one point or another in their lifetime has uttered the phrase, "I'm walking here." And you've said it just like that.
Yeah.
Don't deny it. If you're denying it, you are a liar, and you know where liars go. Okay?
This basically is the precursor to, "You talking to me? You talking to me?"
Exactly.
But
everyone's done that too. Yeah.
But it's very appropriate because I can also see a little Scorsese influence in this one too. There is that urban griminess certainly bleeds into other filmmakers and what they would tap into.
Yep. Certainly a lot to discuss given the context of the late 60s
Yeah.
and this
Yeah.
film's influences for sure.
We're very much in the
So,
American New Wave. The new Hollywood has begun.
yes, absolutely. We did talk about that a few weeks ago that the film or the American New Wave started in 1967. There's no doubt about that.
Hmm.
Historians, cinephiles, critics, I think we can all agree that 67 was really the launching point.
Yeah,
But boy, you get to 69, things really start to kick into a new gear.
they do. They do.
And I'm excited to talk about that here. So, Midnight Cowboy, it is directed by John Schlesinger, and it stars John Voight and Dustin Hoffman. And honestly, that's pretty much it. There
That's
are
really it.
certainly
Yeah.
other characters that come and go throughout the film, but in very small, brief, borderline cameo appearances. It is primarily Voight and Hoffman, those two characters. It is the relationship between Joe Buck and Ratso,
Hmm.
as he goes by,
Yeah.
or Rico.
Rico, he asks to be called by
He
in his
asked to
own
be called
home.
Rico. Yeah.
Ironically, his own home, which is condemned.
Yeah.
Not really
A
his home.
condemned apartment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get into this. If you are not familiar with Midnight Cowboy, it is about a naive hustler who travels from Texas to New York City to seek personal fortune, finding a new friend in the process. All right, let's jump into this. Brendan, what did you think about Midnight Cowboy?
I freaking love this movie. I absolutely love this movie. I've loved it before, and we talked about how great this series has been. The 1960s Best Picture winning series has been thus far, and how the Academy kept getting things right. I think this is another example of it. I think this is one of the better films we've talked about in this series, and I've always loved it. But I think I liked it more even on this rewatch, just given the context of how Hollywood was shifting into this new wave of Hollywood filmmaking. We saw glimpses of it beforehand, but now we're really here full swing. Even though we've also had examples of movies like Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate, which didn't go on to win Best Picture, but really had elements of that experimentation.
And they were
This is
nominated, to be fair.
They were nominated. They didn't go on
as
to
well.
win, but they were
Yeah.
nominated.
Mhm.
But here's a movie that really goes full on into that form of experimentation. The
Yeah.
editing here is a complete enigma, and I mean that as a positive. It is so nightmarish and almost incomprehensible at times. It really takes advantage of that idea of visual storytelling as opposed to narrative storytelling. You really have to pay attention to what we're seeing in a nightmarish and haunting way to really kind of get a sense of what's going on beneath the surface and what's fueling these character motivations. And I really appreciate that about the film. And I also didn't really remember how funny this movie kind of is. It's not
Mhm.
necessarily a comedy per se, but there's an awkwardness and an uncomfortability to certain situations that actually make the movie really funny. It's very much a fish out of water situation, which I think can be very funny instinctually, and I think this movie taps into that very well. And I think just as a tonal balancing act, what John Schlesinger is doing, I think, is really quite impressive. So all of those things, all of those ingredients, just make the movie so powerful for me. But I think on top of that, what really works for me is that it's the loneliness underneath all of that. I've often cited that this is one of the loneliest movies I think I've ever seen, at least as far as Oscar contenders are concerned, because there really is a palpable loneliness in the experience
Mhm.
of Joe Buck and what he's searching for and what he physically can't get. And the idea of him being so lost in a sense of place that is all about finding yourself, or at least what's perceived about finding yourself, the big city where there's so many people around, and how the
Yeah.
more people that are there, the lonelier and more lost you ultimately become. Like that on its face, that thematic idea is so influential in so many Hollywood movies. Not even
Yeah.
Hollywood movies, just movies in general. We talked about that very theme in a movie like All We Imagine Is Light from last year. That
Yeah.
was very much the theme, and there's a little bit of this movie into that. There is
I
a
agree.
ripple effect there for sure, and it just goes to show the precedent that Midnight Cowboy really laid. And I love how this movie was really challenging the form, not just physically, but also thematically and
Yeah.
socially. There are undercurrents of closeted homosexuality being explored here as well, which was very unprecedented for 1969. So there's a lot about this movie I
Yep.
respect, but man, it is a very palpable and lonely experience. And it is not for everybody, but I find
Yeah.
it to be a very moving film.
Okay. I will do my best to articulate this, but I do think words fail to express how jarring it is going from Oliver to this film. It is unbelievably jarring. It is incredible.
That's
A
like going
jolting
from
experience.
That's like going from Mrs. Miniver to this movie.
I mean,
We've jumped 2 decades aesthetically speaking.
like it is crazy, crazy the jump from Oliver to Midnight Cowboy, which given the context of this series and covering the 60s, that blew my mind. I almost texted Brendan 10 minutes into this going, I got to take a break and catch my breath because my God, this is so wildly jarring. But that is the brilliance of it as the American New Wave does kick into a new gear, as you're talking about there, Brendan, and why this film is so remarkable. It is incredible. I agree with you. This is absolutely one of the best films that we've discussed in the 60s. The experimental nature of the film, I agree with you. I love the non-linear storytelling, the way it uses flashbacks and fantasy to depict trauma or the fantasies that these characters are experiencing. It is really incredible. There's a lot of quick cuts, a lot of montage editing that is unfolding, and it is hallucinatory. It is very disorienting. It is hypnotizing in all of the best ways. And I love how that isn't just here for filmmaking's sake, for cinema sake.
Yeah.
I do love how that mirrors the psychological states of Joe Enrico as well. There is purpose to the editing, as disorienting as it is throughout the film. And I love that coupled with the cinematography on the whole. I think the cinematography, the set design, the way that it establishes New York and the various pockets that these characters find themselves in.
This movie could have come out
including-
today and it looks just as fresh as it did back
I
then.
agree. I agree. And I think part of what makes it so engrossing is how the film's aesthetics, how its editing and its hallucinatory state couples with what you were talking about in terms of the deep sense of isolation and disillusionment that both Ratso and Joe exhibit in this film. And boy, that is felt. That is really, really felt, the way these characters are seemingly looking for something. I love the irony that they consider themselves these con men that they're somewhat proud of, but really the only person that they're fooling are themselves.
Yeah.
And how the film deconstructs that over the course of 2 hours is brilliant. It certainly says a lot about America and its state of affairs in the late 60s, but also on a personal level, how easy it is to get wrapped up in the myth of the American dream, only for it to chew you up, spit you out, and leave you completely disillusioned. And the only thing that keeps these two going is their friendship. It is their relationship. You have two broken men finding solace in each other amid that crushing loneliness, and how the film taps into the vulnerability of both of those characters without ever getting overly sentimental. There really isn't an ounce of sentimentality here, which is quite incredible given where this film ends. But I do
It could
love how
have
the
very
film-
much been sentimental, but it does never feel like
doesn't.
it.
It
Never
like,
feels
this is-
overly schmaltzy.
I agree. Like it is stoic. It is heartbreaking and tragic, but that is because of how the film treats these characters and how it gives empathy to them, and the performances here. Jon Voight and Dustin Hoffman, phenomenal. They're both really, really incredible here. And I love how emotionally overwhelming the film is. despite that stoicism, despite being unshowy in its presentation, and how it taps into the alienation of these characters, how it deconstructs their masculinity over the course of the film, all while exhibiting the brokenness of America of the late 1960s and the collapse of the American dream. All of that is tethered impeccably here. Impeccably. Phenomenal movie.
Yeah.
I'm provoked to use the M word here.
Oh,
I think it is
I very much
quite
am.
masterful.
This is a 5 out of 5 star rating for me on Letterboxd. I'm going to go that far. It's one of the best movies we talked about in this season. And, at the end of this conversation, we might give our ranking of the 10 movies that we talked about in this series of best picture winners of the 1960s. But I will say Midnight Cowboy is certainly towards the top. The more you talk about the way that the American dream is treated in this movie, I acknowledged how this movie may or may not have influenced the likes of Sean Baker or Pyle Kapadia with a movie like All We Imagine Is Light. But I guess it's also an influence on The Brutalist, just given the way it treats the American dream and the deconstruction of the American dream. And none of these movies feel at all alike. And yet somehow Midnight Cowboy can find a way bleeding into all of those, which I guess it just goes to show the brilliance of it. And it certainly feels of a piece with where the American New Wave was going, which was certainly about challenging the form and experimenting with different filmmaking tropes. But many of these movies were also about what it meant to be in America at that time. If anything, I would say this movie, Midnight Cowboy, is more in line with something like Dennis Hopper's Easy Rider. I think that's maybe maybe the most comparable thing I can think of as far as that deconstructionist mentality and how broken America ultimately is. And I think this movie taps into that by also showcasing how different America can be depending on where you're from specifically, and how culturally America is kind of a melting pot. They acknowledge that just because Joe Buck comes from Texas, his demeanor and his way of life, that's not going to translate well in New York, regardless of how much he thinks it could. He thinks because of how much of an outlier he is, people will gravitate towards that. But no, they absolutely won't. I think it's Ratso that even says to him, and this is where maybe the film's notions on closeted sexuality come into play. He says, your cowboy stuff is for fags. And I'm quoting the movie there, so hopefully it doesn't sound too demeaning by saying it that way. That's a direct quote from the movie. But it just shows how different Texas and New York are from each other specifically. And America is ultimately that. And I like how it acknowledges that. It acknowledges how varying the country is. And that makes it so much harder to find yourself. And that lostness is so palpable throughout this entire movie. It really gets into the heart of what it means to be lost in a place that is so populated, and how ironic that notion is. It really is something special.
No, I think it's really great. And while the film, as we've been talking about it, impeccably weaves masculinity and sexuality into these broader themes on the American dream and how broken that is by the late 1960s. And that is depicted extremely well here, not just in terms of the storytelling, but again, aesthetically, the rundown, condemned apartment that Rico lives in is certainly indicative of that in some incredible ways. But I think what the movie does brilliantly as well is how it taps further by demonstrating how American culture sells identities that don't really work anymore, but that's all these guys know, and that's what they've tapped into. That to me is what's incredible about Joe, in that he isn't just this naive kid from Texas, but he's cosplaying a fantasy that America has sold for decades up until that point, right? The rugged cowboy that women will throw themselves at. That's something that is
the John Wayne thing. I think he even talks about that. Yeah.
Which is brought up in, like, there's a moment where he's like, I'm John Wayne. And he's like putting on the hat and looking at himself in the mirror.
Yeah.
But by 1969, the cowboy myth was already dead. So his outfit is ridiculous. It's outdated, but he's still playing into the role despite it really having no real power anymore. And the city, which comes through in the women characters here, but also Rico as well, they see right through it. They see
Mm-hmm.
through the facade. And you can say the same thing about Ratso as this hustler, tough guy, that persona that he tries to put on, but he also is someone that is weak. He struggles to walk even down the road. And then, of course, over the course of the film, he gets really sick. So that facade quickly breaks apart as well. So, it
Mm-hmm.
isn't just this story about poverty and friendship, but I do think it is also very much about the collapse of performative American identities, and that the script that these characters had been given by the culture, they were doomed to fail them. But that's all they know. That's
Yeah.
all they know. And how the film continues to deconstruct that as it goes, I think is really quite
Yeah.
brilliant. Again, without ever being schmaltzy about it, it's never
No,
sentimental. It
it's
doesn't.
raw. It's so
It like
raw.
just from moment to moment. I think that is the beating heart of every single scene. How do we tap further into that psychology to deconstruct this facade that these guys are carrying? As
Yeah.
they're like you noted, they're searching for something. They think they're searching for some sort of identity, and the reason that they fail, it's only partially their fault. America is just as much to blame as it is the individual.
Well, and
And that's part of the heartbreak here.
that's a relevant notion nowadays, isn't it?
It's very, yeah,
Especially in our social media culture. That's very much a relevant idea on being sold a facade, a
yeah,
lifestyle in many ways. And that's ultimately what this movie's about. It's why so much of what we see here, as far as the film's use of nightmarish editing, as crazy as it does a lot of intersplicing with radio broadcasts and television broadcasts to showcase what that lie is. There's a very key moment where I think we see Joe Buck getting dressed for some type of event, and it's intercut with some late night talk show very goofily dressing up this dog into some type
yeah,
of costume, which is the
yeah,
most bizarre thing anyone would ever do. You shouldn't do something like that. That's against the nature of that animal.
uh-huh,
And here is America kind of selling this facade, this costume that people are buying into. And I
yeah,
think that fuels exactly what you're talking about, which is why I think it's a very good point that the American dream ultimately was this facade. It was
yeah,
a costume. And
yeah,
those who really try to strive for that find themselves exposed to the fakery of it.
yeah.
And that's ultimately what's happening here.
Yeah, again, and I love that contrast in terms of how Joe sees himself versus others when he arrives in New York. Because when he
Mhm.
first steps off the bus in full cowboy gear, the boots, the hat, the jacket, everything, he is looking at himself as if he's the most handsome man on the planet. And the camera lingers on him.
Yeah.
You get about this 2 or 3 second pause. It seems like it lingers forever, just to emphasize how out of place he looks in New York. And that is immediately followed up, right? So he thinks that he is going to be in demand because of this facade he's putting on, but he's actually inadvertently putting a target on his back, right? And that is indicative when he starts to have these romantic adventures, as he's trying to
Sure.
court
Sure.
these older women. I specifically think of that first moment he has with the Cass character where
Oh
they
yeah.
have
Yeah.
this intimate moment, and it is playful. And going back to the experimental nature of the movie and its rating, where they both get naked and have their little sexual conquest there. But in the aftermath of it, what we see is that Joe's myth of that sexual conquest is actually quite hollow. Instead of being a fantasy object, he's actually emasculated in the moment and feels exploited. And that happens a couple of times throughout the film.
Yeah. It's a very
And so,
brief scene with Cass there. Sorry to cut you off, but
oh yeah,
Sylvia Miles, who plays Cass, also nominated for this movie for a very
yeah,
brief scene, and
very
just
brief
goes to
scene.
show the impression that she leaves.
Absolutely. And it is an important moment here
Yeah.
where because that's the first time in probably his life, at least that's what the film seems to suggest, that he's not really in control, and that maybe
Yeah.
he is being a little exploited, that maybe that facade, there's cracks in it, and how that cowboy identity isn't the shield that he thinks that it is, and that
Hmm.
it's actually built on deep personal trauma. And I love how the film explores that as well, again through its experimental filmmaking and some of the flashbacks that we do see. It
Yeah.
is quite incredible how those flashbacks, and they come, at various points throughout the film. And while we never actually see these pivotal moments, like real deep, meaningful conversations that he has with his grandma, like those brief glimpses are. There's something about the execution of them that gives
Yeah.
the film such a deep pathos that just adds to
Yeah.
that psychological complexity in
It's
Joe. It's
Yeah,
incredible.
it's less interested in the what of it all, and John Schlesinger as a filmmaker is more interested in the sense of insecurity it's meant to give off with regard to Joe Buck and his upbringing. And that's
Yeah.
all we need to know. We don't really need to know as much of what he went through, whether it be his experiences with his grandma and how his grandma raised him, or whatever may have happened between him and his girlfriend and that gang of cowboys, we'll simply say. A lot of that is still uh, I don't want to say it's unclear. I think the movie clearly emulates what happened there, but it's sort of one of these instances where if you watch the movie for the first time and you blink too much, you might miss it. You might miss what
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah.
But there is still this sensation of insecurity in Joe, given whatever we see there. And I think the film is still very successful in emulating what that emotion is. It's
Mhm.
very much creating a sense of feeling as it is a sense of narrative. It's less interested in that, and I think that's what makes the movie so effective. It's a sensory
Mhm.
experience for better and for worse.
Yeah, I agree. And I do love how the film builds the emotion of this film through its filmmaking and the editing, as we talked about, as chaotic as it is, there
Yeah.
is a riveting purpose to it, and how that couples with the storytelling and the and how it builds on these characters and the performances is really quite great. And to speak to something you said earlier about the sexuality of this film and how that is deconstructed in these characters a little bit throughout
Hmm.
the film, I think that very much tethers to what we're talking about here in terms of identity and this facade. Because I also can't help but think of two other scenes in this film with Joe. One of them is Joe's initial disdain for Ratso when
Yeah.
Ratso calls him a fag or whatever the phrase is there, and he
Hmm.
has a response, a pretty visceral response. I ain't no fag. He
Yeah.
is his response back,
Yeah.
and that establishes weirdly the like how like the initial reservations that these two characters have, but they do sense the isolation and loneliness in each other. That's what draws them together. But the way the film continues to deconstruct that sexuality throughout the film, I do think is fascinating because on one hand, perhaps you could argue that there's some sort of curiosity. In the end, though, I think the
Hmm.
relationship between them is reminiscent of something like, of course, in a more different tonally, but I couldn't help but think of something like Pixar's Luca
I was
and
just thinking
how
about Luca, a movie that's able to have its cake and eat it too
cake
by
yeah,
not getting
exactly
too literal in what that definition is.
100%. I think that's exactly what this film is doing in terms of the sexuality or potential sexuality that's there, or maybe it's wholly plutonic, and these two characters discover that vulnerability in each other, and that's what draws them together. But there's also another moment here that makes me question Joe a little bit further, And it's another moment that he has with another older lady later on. And this is near the end of the film.
Is this the Shirley
And
character played by Brenda Vaccaro?
yes,
The
when
actual encounter that he has where he's able to at first not perform sexually?
yes, and they're playing games. He's trying
Mhm.
to, and part of this is that he had taken drugs, I believe. I'm trying to get the
Oh,
timing
yeah,
of
he
it.
was at this, like,
He was
Andy
hallucinating.
Warhol themed party, so he
Yeah,
may have
and so
smoked
like
something, whatever it was, but yeah, but
yeah,
they end up
that could be
playing
part of it.
but they
But
end up playing this game of scribbage, and she calls his bluff in a certain way.
she calls his bluff and straight up, oh, I shouldn't say straight up, but she doesn't hold back in going, are you do you not want to be with women?
Yeah.
And when
I
he hears that, when he understands what she is suggesting, and again, it's pretty direct, then he acts on the moment.
Yeah. What does she say? Like, I guess that he picks a certain word that I guess either begins or ends in Y, and she
Yes, yes,
challenges
yes.
his bluff by saying gay ends in Y.
That's true. Yeah, that's what it
Yeah.
was. That's what it
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
And so when when he hears that and he connects the dots, then it's like, okay, no, I'm here. I can perform. And he does. And so he goes on to perform, but we are left questioning with Joe there, is he just performing because she
Mhm.
called him out? Or is there more to the moment?
Yeah.
Does that explain further how he reacts to Ratso throughout the film? Maybe
Yeah.
it does. Maybe it
Maybe.
does. But like again, like that lingering sexuality and the questions around that for Joe as the film deconstructs his cowboy persona. I think that is
That's
extremely
yeah.
blistering here.
That's
Yeah.
why I'm so glad this movie with that particular story choice came out in 1969. Because I think
Mhm.
in any other year, especially nowadays, if this were a more contemporary movie, it would have been more literal in exploring that homosexuality a bit more directly. And not to say that that's a bad thing, it just would have made for a very different movie and maybe even a more
Mhm.
obvious movie.
Yeah.
But by coming out when it did, when Hollywood, even at the time, was a bit cautious about how it wanted to explore these ideas, it made for a more cryptic and nuanced experience. So you can have an experience like this and view it as an outsider, and you can have different interpretations as to whether this movie is about closeted homosexuality or not. And I think both
Mhm.
perspectives have merit. I think both have a correctness to them. I think this movie could easily be interpreted as a story of closeted homosexuality and the insecurity that comes with that. Or perhaps it's just about the sensitivity of men and maybe in this case straight men. And that's also part of the conversation as well. I think
Yeah.
this movie is able to have it both ways. And
I
that's why
agree.
I think a comparison to a movie like Luca, which I think is very underappreciated as far as a movie that's able to have its cake and eat it too. I think
Yeah.
is actually another great comparison to something like this. It just goes to show how influential this movie is when we're able to compare it to a Pixar movie now, and
I know.
it has
Yeah.
merit in that comparison.
Extremely influential, whether these other filmmakers and films are aware of it or not. You
Mhm.
do see Midnight Cowboy in a lot of movies today. I very much do agree. And again, I cannot reiterate enough. I do love that duality within the film's sexuality and
Mhm.
how that can be interpreted. I think the film gets to have its cake and eat it too, and
Yeah.
how that fuses with the film's ideas, broadly speaking, on America. I do think that every failure that we see here in these two characters, the broken dreams that they display throughout the film, and the deep, deep loneliness that is on display. It isn't just bad luck, it also taps into the collapse of the American myth. That is
Yeah.
also what this film is very, very much about, which is what I love about the dichotomy of them trying to find success in New York City. The
Mhm.
American dream is probably most synonymous with New York City.
Yeah.
That's the city that never sleeps. It's the city of success. You go to New York City, you find your success. And yet we have these two characters that are deeply vulnerable, that are disillusioned, lonely, and finding consolement in each other. And the thing in the end that they choose to do is escape that.
Yeah.
The duality of
irony
New
of that,
York to
yeah.
Florida,
Yeah.
I think is incredible. Like they just look at Florida as some sort of fantasy world, somewhere where they can escape and get away from all of this. And again, given what we see on the bus ride, it is incredibly poignant and heartbreaking and heightens that fantasy versus reality dichotomy all the more.
Yeah.
And I love that here. I think
Yeah.
that in execution is astounding.
I often wonder what happens to Joe Buck when they actually get to Miami and what he chooses to do, if he even really learned anything, because running away to Miami is maybe just another runaway endpoint for him.
Yeah.
This movie kind of has that circular arc for its main character, which we often talk about as one of our favorite arcs in any movie, where they sort of start and end at the same place. But at least here you can argue that Joe has maybe gained at least a little of proper perspective, that maybe he'll start to make the right choices going forward, but he still carries that same lostness that he has for much of this
Yeah.
movie. He's just gained, the experience of a proper relationship with someone to maybe learn the right lessons from it.
Yeah.
But it's very powerful. That ending it's not a tearjerker. It's not schmaltzy. And in any other filmmaker's hands, it could have been.
Yeah.
But it lingers with you. Like, it's a very hauntingly sad ending, and
Oh
I
my
often
gosh,
think
yeah.
about it.
No, yeah, I think it is incredibly saddening, but I do agree with you. Like the film isn't trying to provoke you into tears sentimentally like a lot of other movies do. It's
Mhm.
simply arresting and how it portrays these two characters, the isolation, how they treat each other throughout the film. And there is always a little bit of volatility between them, even when
Yeah.
that relationship is at its peak. There are moments where they're still rubbing each other. But
Yeah.
in the midst of them giving each other a hard time, they also do a lot for each other. And there's this weird domesticity to their relationship where they're
Yeah.
cooking food for each other, and it's often endearing and charming, and they're living this life together even though their life is in this
It's and
a
yeah,
condemned building.
it's kind of a romance movie without being as literal of a
Yes.
romance movie. And
And
again, yeah, it goes
yeah,
back to how we talked about this movie being able to have its cake and eat it too, by not getting too literal about what its orientation is, like what it's
yeah.
going for.
And I love how it breaks down that relationship. I love them, like from scene to scene, the dynamic between Voight and Hoffman is incredible. It's really, really incredible.
Mhm.
And to your point earlier, as far as Joe and where things go for him, I think what's interesting, and maybe this is a slight
spoiler,
but it's necessary for this conversation.
It's an old movie.
We do, yeah, it came out in 1969 after all. But there comes that moment where Joe does shed the cowboy facade. He
Very
does
literally, yeah.
shed that very literally as they're en route to Florida. And given what we see there at the end of that film, does Joe learn anything from this? Does he go to Miami and continue this same cycle of disillusionment? Maybe. There's certainly an argument to be made there, especially given what we see there with Ratso, because that's like that relationship is what was giving him agency.
Yeah. And then
Otherwise,
that gets
his
stripped
trip to New
away.
York,
Yeah.
and then that's stripped away.
Yeah.
So when he gets to Miami, what is he supposed to do? Does he do the same thing but with a different facade, or has he learned from this?
Yeah.
I think that
It's
argument honestly goes both ways, and it's interesting about like the reinvention there at the end of the film, changing costumes. Is that enough, or does the damage run deeper than that? I don't know.
but it's possible he regresses back into that, maybe with just a
Yeah.
different costume, only out of
Yeah.
desperation because he's lonely once again. And
Exactly.
I think the movie is very much interested in stimulating that kind of conversation out of us.
Yeah.
It's a very smart movie that's willing to trust its audience, and I love that something like this came
Mhm.
out in 1969 to do that. It really feels like this could have come out only a few years ago. It
Yeah.
has a
Seriously.
freshness to it, but I think a lot of that also could be just how good the modern transfer is. I watched this on my Criterion disc, and it is a wonderful transfer that looks as modern as any other modern movie nowadays.
Mhm.
It's almost uncanny how this movie is over 50 years old. It is absolutely
Yeah.
astounding.
Yeah, it's great. And I just want to echo again the performances by John Voight and Dustin Hoffman. They're absolutely incredible together. Hoffman's performance is interesting even in the context of this series because just a few years ago in 67, the film didn't win Best Picture, but he's obviously in The Graduate, and
Yeah.
his performance here is a total transformation from what he does in The Graduate. Like,
Just
talk
vocally,
about jarring again.
if you watch this movie without any picture to associate it with, you would think it'd be two different actors. Just the
Yeah,
vocal mannerisms are so different.
it's so different. Such a very, very different type of performance. The physicality that he brings here,
Mhm.
and like not just vocally, but with his body as well. And I just love how Hoffman rides that line of being, and part of this is also the writing, but
Mhm.
the morally grayness of the character, how he taps into that while also being so deeply empathetic in the end as well,
Yeah.
is really quite incredible. And I guess you can say the same thing about Voight as well, like how he taps into that myth, the cowboy myth, how that is deconstructed over the course of the film. Like, he as a performer has to sell that
Mhm.
with his performance, and I think he does such
Yeah.
a great job of bringing a subtle pathos to that that we also feel for Joe. And this, again, it's subtle. Everything about this film is, at least emotionally speaking, the filmmaking is quite brazen, but the
Mhm.
the
But it's yeah.
emotionality of this film, as we've been talking about, it is ardent, but all done through subtlety, and
Yeah.
it's great.
A
It's
great
really, really
filmmaker
great.
a great filmmaker knows how to direct and portray something very brazenly and very loudly, but only at the service of such subtlety. Like, that's a
Yeah,
hard thing to do, and this movie does that very well. It's a very
yeah.
loud and brazen movie, just given some of the editing choices it makes, which are honestly astounding and perhaps in a way should have been illegal at the time. And yet it
Mm,
only makes the movie that much murkier in a way, which I love. Like, I love how it's able to do both
yeah.
simultaneously. It really is quite great.
I agree, and in a lot of ways, this is kind of the perfect Oscar winner because
Mhm.
it's got all of this incredible experimentation and filmmaking that we love, that we adore. This is not a film that was taking it like this was not a safe movie by any stretch of the imagination,
No, no.
and was very much tapping into the American New Wave in that regard. But it does have this, as we're talking about, this subtle emotion to it that by the end of the film, even though it's not schmaltzy, you do feel the emotion, which we know the Academy loves. They love for films that provoke you deeply in that
Mhm.
way. So, like, in a lot of ways, it is kind of the perfect Oscar winner, given the Academy's flavor, so to speak,
Yeah.
and how this film became the influential masterpiece that it is.
Yeah. Great movie. I think,
Good stuff.
I guess as we wind this down, should we look back at the movies we talked about in this series and maybe try to rank some of these as far as what our favorite
Okay.
ones were?
Yeah, we can. To reiterate, we have The Apartment, West Side Story, Lawrence of Arabia, Tom Jones, My Fair Lady, The Sound of Music, A Man for All Seasons, In the Heat of the Night with Sidney Poitier,
Thank you, Oprah.
Oliver, and of course Midnight Cowboy, as we just talked about. So
Yeah. It's
I
a
don't
good
know.
crop. That's
It
overall a
is.
good
Oh, I
crop.
think it's very good.
Yeah.
Like there's a top 5 here that I think is great.
Kind of a slew of all timers in that way.
Yeah.
I'll say this, and I sort of alluded to this. I think it was last week, JD, where I said if I were to make any type of hot take as far as my favorite movies from the 1960s to go on to win Best Picture, there is a chance that Lawrence of Arabia would not be in my top 3 of this decade.
Mm-hmm.
It's not in my top 3.
Okay.
Even though I think it might be the best of these, just given the craftsmanship of it. But I think my favorite 3 of the movies we talked about are, in no order at this point, The Apartment, The Sound of Music, and Midnight Cowboy.
Okay. I mean, 3 masterpieces. I'm not going to push
Yeah,
back.
yeah. It's just Lawrence of Arabia is often cited as one of the greatest movies ever made. It might seem a bit
Yeah.
hot takey to not rank it as high as those others, but those three speak to me in such a way, and this rewatch of Midnight Cowboy just
Yeah.
solidified how much I love this one.
Well, for the listeners out there, let me offer some insight, especially if you're new here. Brendan, when we do rankings, and especially when we get to the end of the year, you'll know what I'm talking about. Brendan does not conform. That is not his.
I
his thing
conform
at
to
all.
Brendan. I conform to
He
me.
conforms to Brendan. Like when he had, I believe you had Oppenheimer at number 1, if I'm not mistaken. That might
Who,
have been
me?
an outlier. Yeah.
When did I have that at number 1?
Maybe
That
you
was
did it.
no.
And maybe,
I did not have it. No, I had
Okay,
Perfect
see,
Days
there-
as my favorite movie of the year.
Exactly. So there you
So-
go.
so-
Never mind. Never mind. I was going to say that as like maybe that's an outlier, but that
was
just
the,
goes to
that was the
prove
one and
further.
only time that I was a normie.
Yeah, exactly. Brendan does not conform. He does his own thing. So just kind of take that with a grain of salt or for what it's worth.
Except Oppenheimer was my number 2 of that year. If that's
Okay,
any
so
consolation.
it was number 2. It was still really high. Generally, though, Brendan's rankings are Brendan's rankings, and
Well,
you
okay.
just
Well, let me.
can't
I'll say-
expect.
Okay, well then let me
the
say
norm.
this: the last movie to win Best Picture, Anora, was my favorite of the nominees to win Best Picture. So I guess maybe that's a
Yeah.
normie response. So sometimes I
Well,
have them.
But see, that's also weird because I don't think that I saw Anora atop of many top 10 lists last year, despite it winning Best Picture, which is maybe ironic, but
I guess I just agree with the Academy for once, which maybe
For
is a
once,
normie response.
strange. Really strange. At any rate, that is to say, longtime listeners, no one here is surprised by Brendan's ranking here. But
Hey,
if you're
at
new,
least-
that's why
least I'm not-
Lawrence. Yeah.
Yeah, at least my top 3 isn't, I don't know, like Oliver, My Fair Lady, and Tom Jones.
Yeah, at least you didn't go crazy. Yeah. You still have 3 masterpieces up at the top, so it's fine. It's all good. Lawrence of Arabia is easily my number 1, though.
Okay.
That to me, that is an all-timer. It's an all-timer for a reason. That's one of the top 50 best movies ever made, hands down. After that, this is where it gets tricky for me because honestly,
Sure.
the 4 to follow, I think, can come in any other order. Honestly, when it comes to The Apartment, West Side Story, The Sound of Music, and Midnight Cowboy, you can rank those 4 however you want. And
That's fair.
I will not lose any sleep.
And
Like at
those,
all.
those 4 movies, along with Lawrence of Arabia as your number 1 there, so that's 5 movies there. Those are also my top 5 of
Yeah.
these 10 movies.
So we share the
talked
same
about.
5 then.
We share the
So,
same 5. It's just the order of them all.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
yeah.
off the cuff, since we're just talking here, for the sake of the exercise, I'll say
Mhm.
Arabia, Midnight Cowboy, The Sound of Music, The Apartment, West Side Story.
Okay.
That's
Yeah.
my ranking off the cuff here. But honestly,
Yeah.
as I said, to reiterate, rearrange those however you want. I don't
Yeah. Yeah, we're not too far off. Off the cuff,
Yeah.
it would be probably number one for me, Sound of Music, then Midnight Cowboy, then The Apartment, then Lawrence of Arabia, and then West Side Story.
Okay. So we share the same 5. And then the bottom 5 again. I don't really have any sort of heated takes as far as the bottom 5 goes, other than the heat of the night is, I would say, fairly comfortably my number 6. And
Really?
then,
Okay.
yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh, well,
Like,
I guess I'm
still
kind of
really
surprised by
appreciate
that.
movie.
I'm kind of
Yeah.
surprised. I thought you would have put A Man for All Seasons above that.
Well, okay. Yeah. All right. Again, the bottom 5 I don't have any sort of passionate feelings on. I do really like A Man for All Seasons, in the same way that I like In the Heat of the Night. Sure. Yeah,
Sure.
we'll go A Man for All Seasons 6, In the Heat of the Night 7, and then Oliver, and then Tom Jones, and then My Fair Lady. That's
I
probably
think
where I'll go.
I think we're pretty lockstep in the ranking of that bottom 5, even in that order. I think I
Okay.
too would go Man for All Seasons, In the Heat of the Night, Oliver, Tom Jones, and My Fair Lady.
Yeah. All right. Yep. That's where I'm at. Yep. That's where I'm at.
So there's Brendan and
Okay.
JD sharing the same brain
There we
once
go.
again.
There we share the same brain. So slightly same top 5, just ordered differently, and then the rest is the same. So
Good series.
decade. Look,
Good
I
series.
will say this as well. That top 5, and look, we haven't gone through every decade yet. We've only gone through the 2 decades. I would take that top 5 over my top 5 of the 40s.
Me
And
too.
looking ahead at the 70s, I would take that top 5 over my top 5 of the 70s as
That's
a
a-
collective.
As a collective, that's a great question. Great point. I think there are some Best Picture winners of the 70s that are probably better than most, if not all, of the individual movies we talked about in the 60s. But I think as a collective,
individually, yep. There's an argument.
okay, I would say,
but
you know
as
what?
a five,
I'm with you. I'm looking at. I don't want to say which movies they are yet because I think the 70s might be our next decade. Just think, given the transition of how America and the new Hollywood was coming to form, we might have to do the 70s next. But I will simply say there are 2 movies that won Best Picture in the 1970s that I might like more than any Best Picture winner of the 1960s.
there's one for sure I can say very confidently.
Yeah, and I think we both agree on what that film is. Maybe, I mean, it's pretty obvious what that film is, but I won't say what it is yet.
Yeah,
but-
yeah. It doesn't take a rocket scientist
let's
to figure
just,
that
let's
one
just
out.
say it's a movie that makes an offer we can't refuse.
Exactly. Yeah.
But there are at least 2 movies I think that won Best Picture in the 1970s that I might like more than anything that won in the 60s. But you're right, as a collective top 5, I think the string of winners in the 60s was a better consistent offering.
Yeah. I mean, well, I was about to give it away, but I guess we already did give it away.
I guess we did. Yeah.
The offer we can't refuse is easily my favorite of the 70s and 60s for sure. But outside of that, I don't know. I mean, we're going to talk about some great films in the 70s, don't get me wrong, but I don't know if as a collective it trumps that 5. And I don't know if on an individual basis, I don't know if any of the others would trump Lawrence for me.
Some of these I need to give a rewatch. I'll say that. There are some movies here I know I really liked when I first saw them, but it's been some time and I might end up souring on them. And then there are some I know I really liked, but I haven't seen in some time and might like more. I don't know.
Should
So
be interesting.
yeah,
Should
it'll be
interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say about Midnight Cowboy or the series at large, leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube. Hit us up on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, Letterboxd. You can email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com, but we would love to hear from you either way.